In October 1943, Luftwaffe pilots were given a simple rule. If your guns fail, you abort, no exceptions. Yet on this day, as another massive US IAF bomber stream crossed into northern France, one pilot would break that rule in the most violent way imaginable. At 20,000 feet, a formation of B-17 flying fortresses pushed through the haze, not searching, but advancing like a decision already made. And below them, a lone Bf-109G6 began to shudder from a fault no pilot wanted to feel at altitude. But Keller didn't turn back. He aimed toward the bombers and toward a kill record that should have been impossible with a jammed gun. For Keller, this scramble began like so many others. Radar plots had shown a heavy bomber stream coming in from the northwest. Another USAF formation intent on striking rail yards, factories, the industrial arteries feeding German armor in the wider war effort. Luftwaffe pilots had learned to recognize these raids almost by smell, the taste of high-octane fuel in the oxygen mask, the oil mist leaking into the cockpit, the way ground control's calm voices hit a quiet urgency. In dozens of such intercepts, the pattern rarely changed. Fighters climbed, formed up in loose staffel, and slashed at the combat boxes of B-17s and B-24 Liberators before American escort fighters could fully close. But as Keller selected his armament, the pattern broke. When he thumbed the switch for his twin MG-131 machine guns and centerline MG-151 cannon, only one indicator flickered to life. The right MG refused to cycle. He slapped the panel, checked pressure, tried again. Nothing. One-third of his forward firepower had vanished before he had even seen the enemy. In a war where a single one-second burst often meant the difference between life and death, that failure was more than a nuisance. It was a warning. Yet the bombers kept coming, their formations solidifying as they approached landfall. At around 20,000 feet, they began the slow, inevitable turn toward their rendezvous, a rail junction near Lille that had already appeared too many times on Allied target lists. Keller, vectoring in alone while his scattered group struggled to assemble behind him after a delayed takeoff, saw at once that he would reach the formation first. His malfunctioning guns meant one thing. If he engaged at all, he would have to get dangerously close, almost to ramming distance, to make each burst count. Meanwhile, the bombers' radio operators reported minimal opposition so far, just scattered flak below and no fighters in sight. Inside the glass noses and waist positions, gunners settled into their routines, scanning arcs of sky they had crossed many times before. Up ahead, the leading crews prepared for the initial point of the bomb run. For one pilot in a single worn fighter, the next few minutes over northern France would test whether nerve and judgment could compensate for failing steel. By late 1943, American bomber crews flying over occupied Europe had learned to trust a brutal equation: altitude, formation, and firepower. The United States Army Air Forces believed that tight combat boxes of B-17 and B-24 bombers, each fortress bristling with up to 1350 caliber Browning machine guns, could punch through German air defenses by sheer volume of defensive fire. A single bomber was vulnerable. Dozens, layered in precise tiers and staggered lines, became a moving fortress in the sky. For Keller, climbing on a vector toward the blind side of that airborne fortress, the theory was not academic. It was the difference between a survivable pass and disappearing in an instant under converging tracers. As his Bf-109G6 ate up altitude, the vibration from the jammed MG-131 grew worse. Every time he adjusted throttle or trim, a harsh shudder ran through the nose, telegraphing the weapon's locked internals into the airframe. The left side MG-131 and the centerline MG-151 cannons still worked, but their synchronization was suspect. Any misfire could send recoil shock through already stressed metal. In the thin air above 20,000 feet, there was no second chance. Ahead, the bomber stream moved like a steel cathedral. Contrails bled from their engines in straight, disciplined lines. Waist gunners stood at open hatches despite the sub-zero cold, eyes sweeping across arcs of sky where German fighters usually appeared. In briefing rooms in England, they had been taught the standard attack patterns: diving from high 12 o'clock, slashing in from the rear, rolling under the tail to rake the belly. Keller had studied the same diagrams in reverse, Learning where their arcs overlapped and where brief seams opened, normally he would have waited. Standard Luftwaffe practice relied on coordinated attacks, staffing of fighters striking in waves, breaking up the American boxes with repeated disciplined passes. But this raid had slipped through a narrow window of confusion. Weather fronts, scrambled communications, and delayed takeoffs had scattered German interception efforts. Keller's group was still assembling, their dots on the ground controller's plotting board not yet aligned. Up here for the next precious minute, he was alone. He throttled forward, pushing the Daimler-Benz engine toward its limits, the nose shuddering under the strain. Below and ahead, the bombers began a gradual turn toward Lille, a critical rail junction feeding German forces from the Western industrial heartland. If this American formation reached its target unmolested, trains would burn, stock would be destroyed, and the strained logistics of the Wehrmacht would fray further. Keller breathed once, slow and deliberate, feeling the oxygen mask straps bite into his cheeks. The instruments in front of him told a simple story. A damaged fighter, one gun compromised, closing fast on the densest concentration of defensive fire yet devised in the air war over Europe. Between doctrine and reality, there was a narrow strip of sky where individual decisions mattered. He was about to cross into it. If you're enjoying this documentary, please like the video and share it with fellow World War II enthusiasts. Hit subscribe as well. Your support really matters and keeps this channel moving forward. He rolled inverted and dove, the world outside his canopy flipping into a tight, vertiginous spiral of cloud and metal. For a few heartbeats, the entire American formation filled his forward view like a gray wall, staggered boxes of B-17s locked into their carefully briefed geometry. The lead fortress, probably from a group like the 381st Bomb Group that had been rotating through missions over France and Germany, held steady at around 180 miles per hour, engines droning in disciplined unison. Keller aimed for the high front quarter attack, the angle every manual warned about, the most dangerous approach, but the one that exposed the fewest guns for the shortest time. The air around him howled. At this closure speed, he would have barely 2 seconds to fire before plunging through the cone of defensive fire. He aligned the glowing ring of his Revy gun sight with the lead bomber's nose, compressed the slack in the trigger, and committed. The good cannon responded at once. The jammed MG-131, however, did something else entirely. As soon as he fired, the damaged gun assembly kicked violently, sending a metallic shriek through the cowling. The forward fuselage shuddered. For an instant, Keller feared the entire weapons mount might tear free. But the shells that did leave the barrel found their mark. His burst clipped the B-17's nose, shattering plexiglass and chewing into the cheek gun position. A spray of smoke and debris erupted as he flashed past. Tracer streams crossed behind him, intersecting where his fighter had been an instant earlier. Waist gunners raked the sky, shredding the contrail he left behind. The 109 shuddered again as a .50 caliber round slammed into his right wing root, sending a dull, sickening vibration through the airframe. Keller yanked away, rolling hard, heart pounding against the straps of his harness, lungs burning in the thin air. Behind him, the bomber's behavior told the rest of the story. The lead fortress's nose dipped almost imperceptibly at first, then more decisively. Smoke thickened from its front section, then from an inner engine. Slowly, then with gathering inevitability, it began to drop out of formation, sliding downward and away like a wounded animal falling behind the herd. In the ordered structure of the combat box, that single falling bomber tore open a gap. Climbing out, Keller took inventory. Control responses were slower. The vibration from the jammed MG was worse. The weapon had now effectively locked his entire forward mount into a precarious state. He could still bring his remaining cannon to bear, but every shot risked catastrophic mechanical failure. Below, the damaged fortress spiraled toward cloud, leaving a thin black smear of smoke as it fell. Most pilots in his situation would have broken off, regrouped, and waited for support. Instead, Keller banked toward the gap. His first attack had opened, his fighter alone against an entire bomber formation that now knew exactly where he was coming from. He dived back into the formation, this time from dead ahead, aiming at the one vector even veteran fighter pilots often avoided. Coming straight at a B-17 from high 12 o'clock was like charging into a funnel of converging gunfire. Keller had internalized that geometry from countless briefings. Today, with one gun failing and the other two strained, he deliberately flew into it. At this closure speed, the margin for error was measured in fractions of a second. Any hesitation, any instinctive flinch, would turn a calculated risk into suicide. Keller centered the second fortress in his Revy gun sight as it loomed larger by the heartbeat, its nose, art, and squadron markings becoming briefly visible through the shimmering air. One cannon, one credible burst. That was all he could rely on. The B-17's upper turret flashed with muzzle fire, faint flickers that preceded the harder, brighter lines of tracers. Keller felt the concussive thumps as rounds grazed his fuselage, punching through skin and frame, each impact a reminder that his lighter fighter had far less ability to absorb punishment than the bomber ahead of him. Training and fear fought for control of his hands. He refused to break early. When he finally squeezed the trigger, the single functioning cannon spat a dense, narrow stream of shells straight into the bomber's cockpit area. The windshield erupted in a spray of fragments. For an instant, the fortress flew on, seemingly unaffected, before a subtle wobble entered its flight path. Without a clear view, the crew could not hold formation. The aircraft rolled fractionally to one side, then slipped off its line, drifting out of the carefully maintained box. Keller snapped his fighter past the bomber's nose so close that for a heartbeat, he saw the interior through the side windows. Shapes moving, hands grasping, a world of aluminum and men he could not afford to think about. Clawing for altitude again, he realized how badly his own machine was suffering. The jammed MG-131 now raked the nose with vibrations so severe they blurred his sight picture. Each burst threatened to shake the forward mount loose entirely. The airframe itself, already pitted by flak and machine gun hits from earlier sorties, groaned in protest. Even so, he stayed inside the formation's defensive perimeter, a zone most pilots tried to escape as quickly as possible after a pass. Here, within and between the bomber boxes, gun arcs overlapped unpredictably. Staying meant risking fire from almost every direction. But Keller had seen something few others noticed in the chaos. Two fortresses, momentarily out of sync with the rest, drifting slightly apart as they tried to compensate for the holes his attacks had opened. There, between them, lay a narrow seam in the overlapping fields of fire, a shared blind spot no manual truly explained. If he could cross that gap alive, he might reach a place in the bomber box where their collective strength briefly became weakness. He dropped through the seam like a blade, tipping his BF-109 almost onto its side to knife between the two out-of-sync fortresses. For a fleeting instant, the sky narrowed to a corridor of aluminum and turbulence, the wingtips of the bombers bracketing his own as if he were flying through a canyon of metal. The two B-17s, momentarily misaligned as they tried to correct for earlier disruptions, left a narrow channel between their fields of fire, a gap Keller could cross in barely 2 seconds. He rolled sideways, wings nearly vertical, slipping through that space as tracers whipped past his canopy. One miscalculation in speed or bank angle, and his wing would shear off against a bomber's fuselage, or his tail would be sliced away by a stabilizer. He had seen the aftermath of such collisions before. Torn wreckage, parachutes blossoming, too low to matter, contrails broken by falling debris. The knowledge pressed against the back of his mind but did not reach his hands. They followed the training, the mental geometry, the instinct honed over years of Luftwaffe service. Inside the pocket, for those brief moments when relative motion aligned just right, he reached a point-blank firing position few pilots ever found. Beneath and ahead of one B-17's inner wing, he squeezed the trigger. The surviving cannon spat a concentrated half-second burst directly into the wing root, where fuel tanks, structure, and control lines converge. Even through the noise, he sensed the impact. Liquid spraying, structure failing, a bloom of fire licking along the underside. The bomber lurched, its wing dipped, then stalled. Within seconds, it rolled off and began a downward turn, flames trailing, engines still grinding in persistence. Keller snapped his fighter away from the expanding fireball, but he was not free. The second fortress's ventral guns, now with an angle on his retreating fuselage, opened up. A stitched line of impacts walked across his tailplane, punching holes through the rudder and horizontal stabilizer. The 109 kicked violently, its balance control surfaces now twisted and perforated. Keller felt the stick go mushy in his hand, the precise responses of earlier flights replaced by sluggish, uncertain movements. He forced the nose level, trading altitude for a margin of control. His oxygen mask bounced against his face from the turbulence of near misses. Part of him wanted to climb out of the formation, to accept that he had done enough damage, and seek the relative safety of thinner opposition. Yet every glance at the bomber stream told a different story. The boxes were tightening, shifting, trying to seal the holes his attacks had opened. That regrouping, confused, noisy, created another fleeting weakness, a moment when doctrine struggled to reimpose order on chaos. Keller steadied his crippled fighter as best he could. The jammed guns screamed in the slipstream, the damaged mount vibrating like an unbalanced wheel. Ahead, through a lattice of contrails and smoke, he saw the formation still turning toward its bomb run. More, in defiance of probability and common sense, he pushed in. Smoke curled from his engine cowling as Keller lined up yet another pass, the fourth major attack against the same bomber stream in the span of minutes. Every instinct, every alarm bell in his cockpit urged disengagement. Above all, the vibrating, jammed MG-131 in the nose threatened to turn every burst into a potential structural failure. Yet ahead, framed in the imperfect lattice of the formation, one fortress had drifted half a wingspan out of position. Its tail gunner, likely rattled by earlier near misses and blinded by smoke from other stricken aircraft, fired in erratic bursts that did more to mark the bomber's position than to deter attackers. For Keller, this misalignment represented the only remaining opening he could reach before the formation tightened completely and escorts arrived in strength. He chose a path almost no training diagram recommended. Coming up from below, he dove low beneath the bomber, dropping into the deadliest slice of sky in the entire engagement, the zone where multiple gun arcs could intersect in a lethal crossfire. Keller banked sharply, then pulled into a climbing curve, rising into the belly arc of the out-of-position bomber. At point-blank range, he fired straight into the bomb bay doors. The explosion was almost immediate. The shells punched through thin metal skin into the space where bombs, structure, and fuel lines converge. A blossom of fire burst along the bomber's underside and blew outward through seams and access panels. The fortress staggered, engines momentarily unbalanced, then dropped out of formation entirely, trailing a widening cloud of debris. The blast wave did not spare the attacker. Shock hit Keller's already damaged 109 like a physical blow, flipping the lighter fighter sideways in turbulent air. The horizon spun, blue and white and gray smearing together. He fought the stick with what remained of his strength, skimming just beneath the collapsing wing of the stricken bomber. A few feet of misjudgment would have turned his aircraft into shrapnel woven into the fortress's final descent. Somehow the 109 remained intact, though barely. Smoke ribboned from panel gaps. Control surfaces, already perforated, fluttered with dangerous imprecision. As Keller clawed back a sliver of altitude, the wider picture finally came into view. The American bomber formation, meticulously assembled over England, no longer moved with the rigid coherence it had shown crossing the coast. It was turning away sooner than initially planned, its boxes uneven, some elements drifting to reform elsewhere. His attacks had not destroyed the formation, but they had forced a disruption severe enough to erode the precision of the bomb run. Below, the rail lines and yards near Lille still waited, their fate altered by minutes. Above, new specks grew larger in the southern sky, German fighters drawn toward the wounded but still dangerous bomber stream. Keller's gamble had not won the war, or even the day. But for this mission, for this target, it had worked just long enough. He had no weapons left he trusted, only a damaged cannon tied to a vibrating, half-broken mount. His maneuverability was sharply reduced by the hits to his tail, and somewhere behind him, still capable of tearing a lone fighter apart with seconds of sustained fire, the remnants of the bomber formation regrouped. Keller turned toward the coastline, toward the faint line where occupied France met the gray sweep of the Channel, his engine coughing as coolant leaked from a wing hit and oil mist smeared across his canopy. Below, the fields of northern France blurred into streaks of brown and green, patchwork rectangles of farmland intersected by thin rail lines and roads. To the men on the ground, the air war often appeared only as contrails and distant thunder. The cockpit stank of overheating oil and burned cordite. Smoke curled along the canopy frame and slipped past tiny gaps in the seals, scratching at his throat with each breath through the oxygen mask. Behind him, the remaining fortresses had reformed into a looser, battered box. One tail gunner still had an intermittent shot at the receding dot of his Bf-109. Tracer rounds began to stitch the air around his right wingtip, bright beads against the pale sky. Keller jerked the fighter into a shallow dive, not too steep to tear the already stressed structure apart, but enough to make his silhouette a harder target for the gunners still trying to extract revenge. Smoke filled parts of the cockpit as he descended, rising from hidden panel damage and seeping through control runs. The smell of burning insulation joined the sharp tang of metal and fuel. The coastline was still around 10 miles away, a distance that in peacetime would pass in moments, but under fire stretched into an eternity. Engine temperature needles edged higher. The propeller wash sent new vibrations through the nose, some from airflow, some perhaps from the increasingly unstable gun mount. Then unexpectedly the bomber fire slackened. The formation, now focused on regaining some semblance of order and reaching a secondary rally point, abandoned the pursuit. To the American crews, the lone fighter was no longer the main threat. Flak, fuel, and navigation loomed larger. Keller exhaled through clenched teeth, a breath he hadn't realized he was still holding fully. But he was not safe. The 109's engine readings remained hostile. Temperature and pressure warned of impending failure. The aircraft was minutes from seizure, and a dead-stick fighter over occupied territory could easily turn a surviving pilot into a prisoner. Keller banked toward a flat stretch of farmland that appeared just large enough to accept a crippled landing. He lowered the damaged landing gear manually, feeling the drag as the mechanisms fought their own scars. The wheels locked with a disturbing, uneven metallic clunk that vibrated up through the airframe. He flared the aircraft at the last moment, bleeding off speed as the wheels met soft earth. The fighter skidded across the field in a plume of dirt and torn grass, swerving but not flipping. When the 109 finally halted, the engine ticked with cooling metal, then fell silent. Keller sat motionless for a few seconds, hands still gripping the stick, listening to a sky that, even now, echoed faintly with the droning of bombers heading somewhere else. The coastline drew slowly closer. When recovery crews finally reached the improvised landing strip, they found Keller standing beside his fighter rather than seated in it, as if he had needed distance from the machine that had both nearly killed him and somehow brought him home. The Bf-109's skin told its own version of the mission. More than a dozen .50 caliber impacts dimpled and tore the metal. Panel seams gaped where blast pressure had flexed the structure. The right MG-131 mount, the source of so much vibration and risk, hung at a crooked angle, its internal damage obvious even before tools touched it. As ground personnel circled the aircraft, marking holes with chalk and sketching damage patterns for later analysis, fragmentary reports from other units filtered in. Radar plots, gun camera film, and eyewitness accounts from both German observers and local civilians along the bomber route began to form a mosaic. Multiple B-17s had gone down or left formation. Others had jettisoned bombs early or shifted to secondary targets. Whatever the American mission planners had intended for Lille-Israel complex that day, the actual impact fell short. The pattern was unmistakable. In Luftwaffe after-action notes, compiled under pressure, and with the broader air war steadily turning against Germany, Keller's sortie appeared as one line among many. A single fighter, one gun effectively reliable, making repeated passes against a heavily armed bomber formation and forcing visible disruption. To some analysts, it seemed almost implausible. Doctrine stressed mass, coordination, and layered defenses. Yet the record from this and similar engagements suggested that on certain days, at certain angles of attack, an individual pilot's choices could punch above their statistical weight. Engineers dismantling his battered 109 later that afternoon shook their heads at what they found. Structural members near the gun mount had been pushed close to failure. Control linkages in the tail showed stress beyond their rated limits. Under slightly different conditions of temperature, load, or impact, the aircraft might have broken apart in the air or refused to respond during the final approach. That it had held together long enough to complete multiple attacks and then survive a rough landing added a mechanical layer to the improbability. Yet the larger truth lay not only in metal and metrics. Across the air war over Europe, both Allied and Axis forces depended increasingly on machines, radar networks, standardized formations, mass-produced aircraft built around repeatable performance. Keller's engagement underscored a quieter constant. Inside each cockpit sat a human being, interpreting incomplete information, weighing personal survival against mission goals, and sometimes pressing an attack that theory said should not work. They did not reverse the outcome of the Second World War, nor did they change the eventual fate of the air forces involved, but they revealed something enduring about aerial combat in that era. That within seconds of decision inside a cramped cockpit, nerve and judgment could bend the path of steel and fire. As Keller walked away from the field that morning, leaving maintenance crews to coax new strength from tired metal, the sky above him still carried drifting trails of smoke. Somewhere beyond the horizon, other formations were already forming, other pilots strapping in for missions whose results no one could yet predict. In the echo of receding engines and the sudden quiet that followed, the lesson of his flight remained suspended in the air, a reminder of how much and how little one determined pilot could change. If you've made it this far, you're one of us, searching for the truth behind the headlines and the courage behind the silence. Subscribe to the channel, and let's keep exploring the hidden wars, secret operations, and untold fates that shape the world we live in.